Welcome to the HiRSE Seminar Series on Research Software Engineering in Helmholtz and beyond.
Okay, sounds good. Hopefully everybody can see this okay.
Yep, that is great.
All right. Yeah, so thanks very much. It's nice to have the opportunity to talk about JOSS. I think there's a bunch of interesting aspects of it that would be great if they were more widely known and more widely used in other parts of the scholarly communications and research software ecosystem. And the main idea here really is that JOSS is a journal both about open source software and that is open source software in a lot of ways. And so I should go back and just say that that Arfin Smith is the editor-in-chief and really the lead founder and runner of JOSS. The slides that are here are kind of a combination of slides from him and slides from me. There's a lot of different people that have been involved in this over a long period. The folks here that you can see are the current track editors, the associate editors-in-chief, as well as the editors. In addition to these editors, I think we've had slightly over 3,000 reviewers over time, but that's a little bit too much to list on one slide. And Abby and Arfin down at the bottom are also doing something called JOSS, which I will talk about as I go through. Okay, so just to start off, we have this idea that when we started, that software wasn't, and still to some extent isn't, a creditable research activity. And so the question came up then about how do we better recognize software contributions? And the options that we were thinking about is that we could try to find some way to fit software into the current system that's centered on papers and on books and computer science on conferences as well. Or we could evolve beyond this one-dimensional credit method. And we'd really like to do the second one, but we don't think we can do it very quickly, so we thought we would just start with the first one. And that's really where JOSS comes in. So the idea then is, what if we just wrote papers about software? And in fact, what if we just wrote as minimal a paper as possible about software? So JOSS then is intended to give us something easy to cite, to not require changes to the existing scholarly communications infrastructure, to be able to raise the profile of software by publishing in both in JOSS and in existing journals. But if you are going to write a new paper about something, that can be a lot of work. And a lot of journals don't accept software papers right now. And where software packages are around for a long time, people tend to cite papers that are many years old and only have authors listed who are the original authors of the software, and don't give any credit to anybody that's come in since that time and made contributions or even become the main developer. And if we weren't going to do this and we're going to have lots of different papers about the same software, then that could lead to citation dilution, where instead of having one paper that has hundreds of citations, you have, I don't know, in the worst case, maybe hundreds of papers that each have a few citations. So JOSS then is trying to figure out, could it be as easy as possible for authors to write software papers? We believe that paper preparation and submission for software that's already well documented should take no more than an hour. We wanted to make a software, a system that was developer friendly for people that were developers, so that it would be easy for them to be authors or reviewers or editors. The main purpose of a JOSS paper is to enable citation credit to be given to the authors of research software. We don't really expect anybody is browsing JOSS papers and reading them in detail, although certainly some people do. And we wanted to get to the point where accepted software in JOSS was equal to an equivalent or equal to an accepted paper in some other journal. So another part of this is then that JOSS is using open source practices. So we use GitHub issues for reviews. We use GitHub notifications to invite reviewers. We have open collaborative discussion in reviews, just the same as you might in a pull request or in an issue. The editors are a community, and we make high-level decisions collectively. We have a bot that helps with commonly occurring functions, and the bot is usable by both by authors, by reviewers, by editors, and by track editors, although different people have different abilities to use it. We have papers that are written in a source format and Markdown specifically, and then get compiled into other formats, which is, in our case, mostly PDF and JATS, although also XML. And JATS is basically an encoding that is used inside the communications community, the scholarly communications community. So the way that this actually works then is that an author makes their software available in a repository with an open source license, and they write a short Markdown paper. They submit it to JOSS by filling out a short form, and it gets into this submitted state. The editor-in-chief, this is actually really a track editor, reviews the size and scope, tries to figure out, is this enough work that we should give credit? We don't want to give credit for, I don't know, somebody that's written 100 lines of Python overnight. So there has to be some kind of size, and we also are focusing on research software. So we do want to make sure that this is software that's useful in research. And if so, we assign an editor, and if not, it is rejected. So the editor then is responsible for finding reviewers, at least two, more often, well, probably two is the most common today, but three is increasingly common. The editors review the submission. Again, this is this iterative process. The reviewers raise comments and issues. Authors fix the issues. This goes back and forth until the reviewers are basically satisfied. The editor accepts the paper. The authors archive the software in Zenodo in some kind of a permanent archive, not in GitHub or GitLab, but something that is archival. And the paper then is published, and it receives a DOI, and that's the end of the process. So, so it's pretty straightforward. Again, it's kind of similar to software, how it works, and we try to follow good open source community practices as much as we can. So when we have submissions that don't succeed, that don't make it through this process, as I said, from the beginning of JOSS, we rejected papers that were not research software. So that's something we have always done. From 2020 onward, we started in 2016. From 2020 onward, we enforced the substantial scholarly communication criteria much more rigorously. And what we wanted to have is basically papers that are at least 3 months of work. And it's hard to judge that, and so that's something that the author makes an argument, the editors look, and they make a decision. We reject about 25% of our submissions before review because of one of these two issues at this point. And then for the ones that make it past that, about 95% get to be published. There's about 5% that don't. We're trying to really balance peer review work and credit for authors with academic trust in the JOSS papers being equal to peer-reviewed journal papers. So we have to do some things, but we don't want to do more than we have to. But we also do want to actually improve the software as well. And the reason that those 5% don't make it through review often is because the authors give up in some case. They don't want to do what the reviewers ask. They don't have time to do it. They've changed jobs. It's no longer important to them, something like that. But in general, if the authors are willing to work with the reviewers and the editor, then things go successfully, and then they get to a publication in the end, as long as they've made it past this first scope bar. So, so in terms of the scholarly infrastructure that I've talked about, the ecosystem, we do our reviews on GitHub, I mentioned before. Our website is on Heroku, and the website is open source, and it's the source of the website is in GitHub. The bot is also open source. It's run on the website and uses GitHub Actions. Software archiving, where that accepted software gets archived, is up to the author. It's often Zenodo. It's most often Zenodo. Sometimes it's Figshare. Sometimes it's an institutional repository. We don't really care as long as it is an archival repository. We use Pandoc to compile papers. The metadata and the DOIs are stored in Crossref, which is the service that issues the DOIs and stores the metadata. The papers and the reviews are archived under a service called Portico. So if JOSS goes away, Portico, we've been basically paying a small amount to be a long-term archive for us. And it's worth saying that we do not have a strongly integrated system, which many other journals do, but we have standard APIs that allow competition and change in each layer. And what we have here is what we have currently. But if something better comes along, we can change any of these layers and change how the system works. In terms of the JOSS reviewers, the editor's job before review starts is to find reviewers. Often this happens because authors can suggest reviewers, and they're often from a list of people who have volunteered to review for JOSS, and as well as people that are external. Editors also have knowledge of the field and potential reviewers. They can search through Google Scholar, things like that. They can use previous JOSS authors, or they can use a machine learning-based notebook that does topic modeling. We've just fairly recently gotten to the point where we have some machine learning work where when a paper comes in, we generate the 5 most similar papers that JOSS has published in the past. And potentially those authors or those reviewers could be reviewers of this new paper as well. The editor's job then, once the review is started, is to help the reviewers and authors come to agreement. And this includes nudging for timeliness, which is actually a big part of the editor's job, is just to ask reviewers, hey, you haven't started yet, could you please start? Or nothing's happened in the last couple of weeks, what's going on? Or things like that. But the editor also provides guidance on the review process and criteria, because it's not infrequent that a reviewer says, here's a criteria that I need to check off, but I'm not sure if this meets it. Here's why I think it does, but I'm not confident. And the editor then can help with that. So JOSS reviews are really a collaboration where the editor is effectively kind of sitting in between the author and the reviewer. They're interacting as well. And we're using the bot and the tooling to actually make all of this happen as easily as possible, with the submission then that's kind of the center of this that's being looked at being the paper and the software. The reviews are checklist driven. And so the items on the checklist are agreeing to a conflict of interest policy and a code of conduct, doing some general checks on the repository URL, the license, the contribution, and the authorship, some functionality checks on the software regarding installation, functional claims, and performance, checks on the documentation, a statement of need explaining what the software is for, installation instructions, example usage, functionality documentation, automated tests, if possible, at least tests, and community guidelines. And then finally, the software paper itself, that there's a summary, a statement of need, a state of the field, the writing is of decent quality, and it has good references. The review criteria, then, these things that are checked off, in some cases, there is guidance for them. And in particular, we have guidance for installation, for API documentation, for community guidelines, and for testing. And these guidelines then have different levels. And so just for example, for installation, there always are 3 levels, good, okay, and bad. But for installation, good is that the software is simple to install and it follows distribution dependency management approaches that are standard for the language being used. Okay is that there is a list of dependencies together with some kind of automation to handle that. And bad is that you can't figure out what the dependencies are, or the installation process is not automated. So to check off this criteria for a reviewer, it has to either be okay or good. And by doing this, we encourage the authors to move from okay to good. As a community, then these practices, and in particular the levels, we think have influenced reviewers and developers in terms of what's good, where they should be, and what's minimally acceptable. And this is similar to what our OpenSci has been able to do in the R community. We know that cultures change based on rules and incentives. And so JOSS is really trying to provide rules, and at a high level, it's trying to nudge these incentives, trying to make people want to do what's good rather than what's minimally acceptable. Over time, the community changes, and JOSS levels also change. We become stricter. And finally, I'll just say that if software was cited directly, which some of us would like to see in the long run. We wouldn't really need these JOSS papers, but the JOSS review process and the JOSS community, we think would still be really important in shaping values and in improving how we build software and how we develop and provide software. Okay, in terms of communication, GitHub issues, which are public, is where most things happen. There also is some discussion in Slack that's mostly private for editor discussion, like between editors or kind of management-related stuff. But for specific specific submissions and decisions about them and discussion that involves the authors, everything is public. We use a blog for calling for editors and for general news about the journal. I would say we do calls for editor somewhere around annually, although it's not really annual. It's more when we feel like enough editors have decided to retire or finish terms, or the load of new papers coming in has increased. In terms of outreach, we post automatically about new papers as well as about general news more manually on Mastodon, as well as we had used X until June of last year, although we've given up now on X or Twitter as it used to be. I'll just make a comment that it seems like it's become increasingly useless at this point, and I think that was a good decision we made. The other thing, as I mentioned back at the beginning, is we have this JOSScast podcast that's a new thing that's really just started. I think we're just on our fourth episode that's come out, I believe, last week. And so the idea here is that Abby Kavanagh-Mays and Arfin basically interview different authors of published papers and record that and then make it available. And it's aimed at both researchers who are interested in the experience of those authors, as well as the public who are just interested in kind of what is this kind of software stuff and how does it work. And it's intended to demonstrate the value of open source research software in general, as well as the specifics of the software developed by the authors. And how this has changed the way research is conducted by the authors being able to talk about how their software is being used as well. And this comes out every other Thursday, and it's available through a bunch of common platforms. So having talked a bit about how we do things, maybe I'll just talk a little bit as we get towards the end about kind of how some of this actually works. Reviewers often volunteer to be JOSS reviewers. They volunteer to go into this reviewer pool. We often need a relatively small number of invitations to identify reviewers. I think we are around 2 or 3 invitations per successful reviewer that we get. We get semi-regular emails from people that have volunteered and then are annoyed that they haven't actually been asked to review yet, which is nice. A problem that we have is that when there's a package that comes in that people know about, because this is public, we can often have reviewers that volunteer to want to be associated with the review of this project because it's something they know is going to be cited. And another potential issue is that good reviewers, people that do good quality reviews and do them relatively quickly, can become well known because this is all open, and that can potentially lead to them being called on more than they should be and potentially burning out. We have no privileged information in the system, so the reviewer reports and the editorial decisions are available to everybody in the world, not just the reviewers and editors and author. This increases transparency, and we have public declarations of potential conflicts, which is, I think, good. Editorial decisions are generally documented in the open. I think we have clear expectations of authors. The infrastructure is a lot more simple because we don't have to worry about hiding things and permissions, and people can link to their reviews, so people can get credit for the reviews that they've done. But sometimes this has some issues where authors can be unhappy that they haven't heard back in a while, and they can ask reviewers what they're doing, which wouldn't happen in a closed system. They can ask editors, and that makes both reviewers and editors somewhat unhappy, depending on how the authors choose to ask them. And there's also potential cultural barriers to entry for some who aren't happy with this or aren't confident about their ability. And there can be negative dynamics for junior staff who maybe are not willing to criticize more senior authors in some case. We think that that's overweighed by the benefits of the publicness and the transparency, um, but there are negative aspects. In terms of scaling, we have challenges about scaling people processes more than automated processes. The editor-in-chief issue and managing editor rotations has been an issue. We've brought on more editors over time, and we've started talking about, and in some cases, having term limits for editors. Technology improvements have helped. These help us with being able to do smarter review assignments, better monitoring tools for editors to understand what's going on with their submissions, and better tools to help authors prepare their submissions. As you can see on the right, last year we had about 400 papers, and we are basically slowly increasing. 2020 with COVID basically was a bit of a change where we went from increasing almost linearly to more or less flat with a bit of an uptick. And we've written a blog post in 2019 about a bunch of these scaling issues. I put the DOI that's down at the bottom in chat at the beginning of this, but that is the DOI to these slides, and so you can go to this and click on any of the links as well. In terms of reviewer feedback, we've gotten these nice comments. This is a restoration in faith in the scientific process. It feels like a collaborative conversation with the author. Incredibly impressed by the fluidity of the process. It's a great model for how other journals should operate. The review process is well organized, insightful. I've really appreciated the input, and it's improved the software. And that's actually one of the things we really like to see as authors that feel like their software is improved through the process. People that have enjoyed reviewing, people can do their work on a phone while commuting, which is kind of nice. I've actually accepted a paper on an airplane, which I was kind of surprised by on my phone. It was possible to do that. And this is from an author, the best experience I've had due to the tooling and the process, and that leads hopefully to people reviewing, volunteering to review. People are also appreciative of the bot. It used to be called Whedon. It's now called Editorial Bot. So people thank the bot, which I think we actually have something where the bot now replies and says, "You're welcome" or something like that. People like the bot. And again, thank the bot. So it's nice to see stuff like this. In terms of costs, if you're interested, we are entirely dependent on volunteers. We pay some costs. Crossref, getting the DOIs is the biggest cost that we have at $275 a year, all US dollars. DOIs cost $1 per accepted paper, so that's another $400 a year. Website hosting is another couple hundred. Domain registration is basically free. This leads us to a cost of about $2.50 per paper at 350 papers a year. It doesn't include about 50,000 in infrastructure development that was paid for by a Sloan grant. It doesn't include GitHub usage, user donations, and AAS fees. AAS is an astronomical journal that we have a partnership with. So if somebody submits a paper to one of the AAS journals that includes new software, AAS asks us to review the software, and they review the science, and we publish at the same time, and they give us something like $20 or $25. So that helps us a little bit with some of our costs. We calculated and documented this also in 2019 in another blog post. It's mostly still correct from 2019, except we didn't not plans for legal issues. And so we've had two interesting issues that are, because the system is completely open, people can see submissions to others, and this leads them to potentially complain. And they can complain saying, like, this software that somebody has published was based on my work and I should be credited, or I should be an author, or this shouldn't be allowed, or in the worst case, don't go forward with this or I'll sue you. And it might be better to have these issues arise before publication, but in the case where there's or I'll sue you, that leads us to actually have to pay a lawyer in many cases to deal with this. And again, there's been two issues of this over the 7 or 8 years. So it's not a common occurrence, but it is one that we didn't plan for. I didn't actually mention, but I'll just say here, JOSS is a part of NumFocus. NumFocus is a umbrella 501c3 organization in the U.S. 501c3 is a nonprofit charity, basically, that serves a mission, and NumFocus's mission is to support scientific software. And so, because JOSS is a member of NumFocus, one of the services that NumFocus provides is partial legal support, and so that has helped us to some extent. In terms of collaborations, as I mentioned before, AAS articles, we have this partnership with. I'm sorry, it's $50 a paper that we end up getting from this, and so that helps support what we do. The JOSS infrastructure is also used by the Journal of Open Source Education. It's used by JuliaCon for their proceedings. It has been used by Europar for some artifact publication, and we're open to more collaborations. Again, we can, there's at least one post about one of these collaborations. So that's really all that I wanted to say. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. I'll just mention kind of down at the bottom, we do require open source initiative licenses. That's how we decide what is open source. The Gordon Betty Moore Foundation gave us a small gift at the beginning. The Sloan Foundation gave us one grant for our infrastructure work. I mentioned NumFocus that we're part of. And we were heavily inspired by a lot of the work that our Open Science had done in R. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our seminar. Please check out the slides on Zenodo linked below and see you next time.